Welcome to Sustainable AF, otherwise known as everything you ever wanted to know about sustainability, but were too afraid to ask.
This series is discussing the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and every episode we're going to focus on a particular goal, on the issues that matter at both a global and a country scale, as well as the solutions, the technology available, the policy options, and the education needed to address it.
This week, our SDG is number 2, zero hunger. Now, you can't ask for something more reasonable than stopping hunger. Goal 2 is a global commitment to tackle undernutrition and hunger by 2030. Hunger seems like a really obvious thing to solve, i.e. give people food. But it's a complicated issue with lots of factors and different levels. The big picture image is starvation, following wars and natural disasters, and that's terrible. But its biggest impact is the gnawing effect of malnutrition and instability. Poor and inadequate nutrition leaves people vulnerable to disease and illness and causes stunted growth. This year, in the global pandemic, health and strength has been highlighted as something that really matters to beating it.
Now, we know, as Alex has mentioned, that people starve in difficult times and places like war zones. But also there are other things that will have an impact. So areas affected by climate change. In Bangladesh, for example, a lot of the groundwater has been used for agriculture and seawater is seeping in. That's affecting the ability to grow crops. In Syria, the war is actually causing people to not have access to food. Conflict is such a huge issue. Shocks like climate change, such a huge issue. These are things that make zero hunger so hard to achieve. And it's only going to get worse as the environmental impact becomes more regular and destructive. We've seen the impact of floods and droughts and extreme storms and fires, and we have to try and work out how we tackle it.
The problem has also been exacerbated and highlighted by COVID. Malnutrition is especially important post-COVID. While food insecurity is on the rise, and if you want to know what that means, think about the fact that nearly 150 million children are suffering for wasted and stunted growth around the world. Further to this, nutritional poverty is it's going to get worse with economies under strain, jobs and unemployment at risk. As Fee said, add to that climate risk. Look at just 2020. We had locust storms, for God's sakes. You're seeing a perfect storm of factors that are going to affect up to 85% of food producers in the developing world. Think about the knock-on effects of that.
There's a real question at the heart of the discussion of hunger as to why and how in 2020, with all the wealth we have in the world, why is there hunger anywhere? But the cold hard facts are that around the world, over 820 million people don't have enough of the food they need to live an active, healthy life. That's nearly 11% of the global population. That's a crazy statistic. You know, part of the Human Rights Declaration is that we all have the right to food. And we have to think about the way food is managed. The fact that about a third of food that's actually produced is going to waste just shows that there's this huge distortion here that needs to be addressed. Basically, the system is broken.
We're not denying it's a complex goal. Our ability to address it is linked to so many other challenges that need to be fixed. And in the same way as we looked at poverty inextricably linked to hunger, it's a sort of problem that if we can fix that in the right way, it will help us to fix hunger in the right way and vice versa.
Yeah, and ending hunger means a lot of different things. You know, like poverty, there are different types of hunger. Nutrition matters because you might have access to cheap food that fills the belly, but it doesn't necessarily mean it gives you the vitamins and minerals you need to function. Food waste matters because so many people could live on what we throw away every day in the UK. But how do we manage the logistical task of making that happen? One of the questions we've got to ask, it certainly in the UK right now, is food banks. You know, are they the best solution to people who can't access food? It's so obvious how poverty and food are related.
Absolutely. Efforts to reduce food poverty have been countless, from food banks to Live Aid. I remember growing up, the famine in Ethiopia. But the fact of the matter is, it's not enough. And in 2020, we still have hunger in both the developed and developing world. This isn't just a developing world issue. And as we've just highlighted, it's not that we can't produce enough food, because we absolutely can. It's about the distribution of that food, which is the issue.
Yeah, and the thing is, that's distribution is about access, but it's also about the sort of food. and it's about how it's produced. It's about how the food web works and how the way in which we get enough food is going to have an impact on the climate and the environment. I mean, the food system's got impacts from fertilizer runoff in the water system to gene-engineered seeds that won't propagate the following year. The way in which the agricultural system works has a huge impact on wider global systems.
So today we're going to look at the food system and where and how we're going wrong on a global and local scale. These are the following issues that I think we need to highlight and discuss in this topic: global inequality of food, globalization and what that's done to the food web, food waste, the argument around the meat-based diet, and also the difficult to reach places like war zones. As well as, let's look at the solutions that include nature-based solutions and rethinking agriculture to food sovereignty and much more.
And inequality also has a really big role to play. Like poverty, there are different levels of access and different levels of control. Global inequality in food production has resulted in more people being obese than starving. Now, again, this makes no sense that more people die from overeating than starving to death. This is what makes all the hunger statistics so confusing. And education and behaviour really matter. This might sound really crazy, but there was a period of time in North London a few years ago where there was a sort of discussion amongst doctors about the problems of muesli malnutrition. And what that meant was there were a number of mothers who were so concerned about their children having full fat milk or, fatty foods or this, that, and the other, that they weren't actually giving them enough of the foods they needed to grow and develop. Now, there are lots of different elements to this, and we need to look at this from the perspective of how it works at a country level to how it works at an individual level. So I think, one of the first things we really need to talk about is food sovereignty.
Yeah, greater food sovereignty is one solution to balance the inequality of consumption and distribution of food. And what I mean by food sovereignty is it's producing, distributing, and owning the food in your country. And that's a really important topic when you're talking about hunger.
Yet globalization has actually meant that a lot of the time goods produced in some of the poorest countries are exported to richer countries. And at the same time, industry lobbies work together to ensure that prices are as cheap as possible to increase their own margins. Coffee is a prime example of this. Things like fair trade are trying to address it, but unless it's visible, people don't necessarily recognize that it's a problem.
Absolutely. Eco-labels do play a really important role in finding out where our food is produced and who's producing it. Do they have any sovereignty over what they're producing? And are they getting paid a fair price for the food they're producing? This has been exacerbated when you're looking at global supply chains. We need to think about the way the agricultural system works, not just in what and how we grow food, but how it's distributed. The global inequality in distribution also needs to be addressed due to the way global markets work. COVID, here we go again, showed huge holes in the resilience of supply chains, meaning supermarket shelves were left empty. Think about this. If we produced food locally and ate more seasonally, this wouldn't have been an issue because it could have gone from farm to supermarket. It's because the container ships couldn't move, the planes couldn't move. Supply chains that distribute our food needs to be explored more to build more resilience in. Food miles is another really big bugbear of mine, and the carbon footprint attributed to food miles. This is a global problem because of globalization. We ship produce all over the world and it causes a huge amount of pollution in doing so, which basically is unsustainable. We need to look at food sovereignty and controlling where our food is coming from so it's not affecting such a large carbon footprint.
And I think one of the things this brings us back to behaviour, it's about our relationship with food. Do we understand where our food comes from? Children and adults need to be educated as to where food comes from, what's in a chicken nugget, how many nutrients are in it. There's no question that the fast food revolution, partial cause of the obesity epidemic, and that's spread through the world, causing a multitude of health problems. That's actually currently related to the way in which people eat too much meat. This is one of these big debates in academia and around the kitchen table. There's no question of the negative effect that industrial meat production has on the environment, as well as the quality of the meat. And it's wholly unsustainable to continue farming in this manner. But actually, that isn't the end of the meat debate. And I know, Alex, that you've been actually talking to me a lot about this and about how we've understood the red meat debate in environmental terms.
Absolutely. Cow, sheep, pigs, chickens, they're not evil. It's the way we as humans produce them. It has become deleterious to us in the consumption and what they're doing to our environment. Here's some facts. There's 1.6 billion cattle on Earth, and their burps and farts are becoming a big problem. Cows expel methane, a colourless and odourless gas, which is approximately 84 times more potent than carbon dioxide when it comes to warming of the planet. So that's a really big issue. And I can completely understand the climate side of the debate. However, this can be mitigated by one, methane mask, which is literally a high-tech mask that you put on a cow and it catches at source methane. That's one solution. Or two, breeding cattle that produce less methane. Cows at the moment are seen as enemy number one on the negative emissions radar for all those burps. However, you can raise cows and all livestock in an agricultural setting that is in fact carbon negative. I'm going to put in the show notes a link to a guy called Alan Savory and his very important TED Talk about how cattle can help, one, fight desertification, which is a massive problem all over the developing world, but also help reverse climate change by drawing down carbon into the more nutrient soils that cattle and livestock help provide.
And I think that's a fascinating thing, and I actually urge you to have a look at it, because one of the things we all need to understand is how little we really understand. We get a lot of our information from things that we read or things that we listen to, but how many times do we actually know the facts ourselves? One of the things I think we can all relate to is food waste, just because we all actually waste way too much food. And it's a massive problem when you look at global food production. And there's a World Bank report called Water Waste 2.0, which actually says we waste over 1.3 billion tons of food every year. 44% of all waste globally is food. I'll just let that sink in for a minute, because we talk a lot of the problems of plastic waste, but nearly half of all the waste in the world is made up of food.
Crazy feat. And this brings me back to my focus on food sovereignty and bringing things more local. Building resilience in local systems means more can be produced and consumed at a local level, resulting in less people going hungry, less pollution being created by food miles. This, as one example, can be exemplified well in Detroit, old industrial city. Car production moved abroad due to globalization. People were getting pretty hungry. People started taking an initiative and turned their front gardens and communal areas into veg patches. What a great idea. People are eating what they're producing locally. They're saving on buying it from big supermarket chains. And the nice thing is this can be rolled out all over the developed and developing worlds. And we are seeing a growth of city farms. It's becoming very fashionable now. It also includes changing people's eating habits to look seasonally and what we can grow locally. I know for a fact, because of the way the world is set up and globalization is so prolific, if I want to eat avocados from Mexico at my table in Oxford, I can do that. In some ways, that's really cool because it means I get a wide variety of foodstuffs for my diet. However, it's not doing the planet any favors. And if you want to leave the planet better than you found it, we need to start thinking about that.
Yeah, and I'm sorry I nearly interrupted, but what I was thinking about when you were talking about Detroit was how often that has happened when there is a crisis. If you look at the UK during the Second World War, most gardens were turned into farmland. It happened in Cuba when I can't even remember the word for when the blockade happened. You know, huge city gardens, city farms. You talked about that. We've got urban farming as well. There's so many different ways in which we can actually learn to eat differently, grow differently, explore things. I mean, there was a whole big trend a few years back for seed bombing, when people would take groups of seeds and just throw them out into green areas to see what happened. Because one of the things is that this is connected to poverty, because if it's great if you've got a garden and can grow things in it, but what if you don't? So again, it's about how you connect everything together. We know that people need to be educated about how to grow, how to eat, and how to recycle food in a more sustainable manner. Only then can we try and achieve zero hunger globally. There's just a massive disconnect today between where and how food is produced and the end consumer, and we've got to deal with that. This is actually done by education, educating children and adults, thinking about how food is produced, thinking about where it's produced and how it ends up on your plate.
The cow debate, I think, especially highlights this, but this whole debate highlights the difficulties about finding out what exactly is good for us and the planet as a whole, looking at the system again. But engaging with both sides of a debate and understanding both is vital to establishing good health and well-being. Yet another incredibly important sustainable development goal. So now we're going to talk about getting more educated, and this is what we need to discuss. Agriculture. It's massive. It's not being talked about enough. Current farming methods globally are completely unsustainable and are leading to more and more desertified land throughout the world. The constant tilling of soil and overuse of synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and fungicides are wreaking havoc on biodiversity. And if anyone's watched any David Attenborough documentaries, you all know how important biodiversity is. There's also poor water management and the mass production of single crops. This means more and more land is no longer fertile, and we're having to use more and more chemical inputs, and this just basically isn't sustainable. This is not only happening in poor countries along the equator, but wealthy countries like the US. I don't know if you've ever heard of probably the biggest negative impact of tilling is something called the Dust Bowl in the US. And it basically meant the entire internal agricultural land of the US was a desert, and they've had to work really hard to bring it back, but only through synthetic products. And it's meaning the land is getting more and more degraded year on year. There is a fantastic documentary, which I would recommend everyone listens to, about a new way of farming called Kiss the Ground. And Woody Harrelson, the great actor, is the documentarist. It's on Netflix. It highlights the global issue we are facing from current farming methods, as well as some fantastic solutions, namely regenerative agriculture.
And one of the things that makes this so important is that actually, if we can help fix the global agricultural problem, we're actually going to be addressing hunger and climate change and biodiversity at the same time. Alex mentioned regenerative agriculture. But what it is, it's actually a system of farming principles and practices that actually do enrich soils. They improve watersheds. They increase biodiversity. And overall, that enhances ecosystem services, which we haven't even talked about yet. What it actually aims to do is capture carbon in soil and in above ground biomass in plants, reversing all the current trends of atmospheric accumulation of CO2. But at the same time, it actually offers increased yields of crops because they grow better. It builds resilience to climate instability. And what that actually ends up meaning is higher health and vitality for farming and ranching communities. And the thing is, this doesn't come out of nowhere. It actually draws from decades of scientific and applied research by the global communities who specialize in organic farming and agroecology. Alex, I know this is a very special topic, very close to your heart because of what you do. So can you sort of explain what sorts of things we talk about?
Absolutely. So I think you've just defined regenerative agriculture really well there. But basically, what this is a win-win-win solution. It reforms a broken system, which is the way we produce our food, to a more climate-friendly, profitable, so better for farmers, better for rural economies and areas. It makes it more attractive to be back on the farm, whereas at the moment it's a pretty tough life. It gives us a higher quality of nutrient-dense food with less chemical inputs to it. And for me, most importantly, it sequesters carbon in the process, which, being that I've spent the last 2 years focusing on climate change and what to do about it, it's a wonderful solution to me. I love all the renewable energy stuff that we've talked about a lot, Fee, and we've researched. I love electrification of transport, but I cannot get off this interest around more sustainable farming. Other things within regenerative agriculture, growing trees. This is called agroforestry. And you can actually imagine how many thousands upon millions of agricultural acreage we have around. Just imagine if you had rows of trees on each one of those fields that are also, one, sequestering more carbon, but two, you're also stacking enterprise on land. You're growing crops, but you're also growing trees. Those trees have a timber value, but they also have a value for carbon credits. If a farmer can get paid for sequestering carbon as well as growing nutritious food, what a wonderful idea that is. Another idea, silvopasture. Now this is growing livestock and trees together. The livestock benefit from the shade of the trees, and as our climate warms, that will become more and more important, as well as the trees providing the cattle a more diverse diet than just eating corn and corn and corn. Another end of the spectrum, and we're going to follow on to more technological solutions here that Fee's going to talk about, but vertical farming. The Dutch are huge in creating hydroponic vertical farms in warehouses where in urban areas you can grow a huge amount of food with almost no land. And this is another really interesting part of farming, the way we're producing food. So I think I've found something really special here, and I truly believe that agriculture is where renewable energy was 10, 15 years ago. We're just at the beginning here, and the ball is really starting to roll. So I'm going to put a lot of links into the show notes if people are interested. Onto technology.
Yeah, now technology, as usual, does have a role to play in fixing food production. But the thing is, it doesn't always have to be new and exciting technology. Alex has talked about hydroponics. That's been around for a really, really long time. But until they thought about using hydroponics in warehouses to sort of grow green vegetables in the middle of the city, it hadn't really been integrated properly into the day-to-day supply chain. You know, we've got satellites and weather prediction. These are incredibly important in terms of, you know, farmers' ability to protect their crops. We've got new approaches to actually planting seeds in areas without a lot of groundwater, but you plant seeds with systems so that they contain their own water within these amazing materials where the water sort of comes out over a 6-month period. And you can actually massively increase the number of seeds that will turn into plants. You've got things like the creation of therapeutic foods where you add nutrients and density for the starving. You've got insect farming. Cricket farming may sound really weird, but actually, you know, crickets have an awful lot of protein. We've got microalgae that could be developed and turned into different things, and plant-derived meat, which, you know, I'm sure you've been reading about. There's even, and this to me was one of the weirdest ones, edible drones. This idea that you're sending out drones to areas with food scarcity, but every part of the drone can be eaten. There's so many imaginative entrepreneurs out there, so many technologies that can be turned to good use. There's so many incredible ideas that we have the capacity to affect the change we want to see. We've just got to get the system around it right.
I've eaten insects and they're actually delicious. I asked you, Fee, would you eat an edible drone made out of insects?
Well, I've eaten chocolate-covered crickets before, so I might well.
They are good, aren't they? Right, back to it. Now we're going to talk about policies. They're really important and they do have a huge effect, whether it's from international charities, the UN, development banks, international aid assistance. These all put into place really robust policies that help lift a lot of people out of hunger. I'm going to come back to the agricultural thing here and look at how policies are shaping UK agriculture. Now we've Brexited, the government has a greater focus on meeting their 2050 Paris Climate Agreement goals. And they've looked to the agricultural space to how can we use our farmland to assist in the climate crisis. And there's two policies they've put forward. One is the Sustainable Farming Initiative coming in 2024. And then further to that is the big one from the stepping stone of SFI is ELMS. That's the Environment Land Management Scheme. This is how farmers are going to get paid their subsidies in 2027. And it's about working with farmers to help solve the climate crisis. And that's using things like I was talking about with the regenerative agriculture. Another big way that policymakers can make a difference is tax. If we put a proper price on carbon and taxed it It would mean higher prices for producers that have a large carbon footprint and lower prices and lower taxes for people that have a lower carbon footprint. Now, this is a bit of a no-brainer to me, but it is a bit of a paradigm shift. So I'd like to dive into it more.
Well, I think we're going to talk a lot more about carbon in the future, even though it's an underlying thing with a lot of the issues that we address. But what that point really, really raises is the fact that we have to look at this as a system problem. And that means we can find system solutions. And that we do by finding a way of connecting everything. So, for example, there is an issue about food as fuel. Now, there is a challenge around the idea that actually people need food more than fuel. But the point is that, circular economy practices have seen biofuels become more and more attractive when trying to address the climate crisis. But it doesn't have to be things like, food that we're going to eat immediately. It can be food after it's been processed. So look at the use of vegetable and animal fats from cooking oils as fuel. It's much cheaper than petrol or diesel, and you've already bought them. Now, if you're going to look at biofuels as a main source of fuel, there are huge issues around forests being chopped down or regrown just to make fuels, or what happened with corn in the US. I don't think that's a good use of land. But the point is that there are different ways of using what we have.
The extractive model that we have used for the last however many 100 years of just taking something out of the ground, processing it, and then dumping it is no longer sustainable. And I guess that's what Fee's touching on with food as fuel in the cyclical economy. Why do we throw away all of our chip fat? Why do we just chuck everything in the bin and then it goes into a landfill? That can actually be processed and used as a fuel, which is a brilliant idea. Highlighting again what Fee just said, though, we cannot do what we've done with corn production in the US for meat production, essentially. We need to use biofuels as a small part of a portfolio of things that make up a more sustainable world. The same can be said for food as a fertilizer. Food can be broken down and made into compost that we can use as fertilizer on farmland to grow crops. It's a bit of a smelly topic, but there's one hell of a lot of human waste out there that can be sanitized and used to re-nutrient the land. Now, I know you're probably now thinking, as I did, that is disgusting. But if you're in the US and most places in Europe, if you've ever bought a bag of compost to put on your garden, it will probably have human waste in it. It's a really weird relationship humans have with human waste. But at the moment, all we're doing is flushing it down a toilet, and then it's going into a water processing plant, and then it's coming back through our taps. And if we kind of think of it like that, it's kind of already in the system. Why not make better use of it, use it to fertilize ground that isn't fertilized currently?
And that does make a lot of sense. I mean, certainly if you look at a lot of wastewater treatment, what you're seeing more and more of is municipalities trying to use the sludge that's left over, which, let's be honest, is a lot of that is going to be human waste, although it's other waste as well. But that can directly be used as fertilizer, and it actually helps close the circle. Certainly, people might have a problem with it, but I remember in Australia when there was a water crisis, there was a big issue. People didn't want to drink water that had been through somebody. And I remember jokes in London 20 years ago, 30 years ago, which is like, we've got the cleanest water in the world. It's been through at least 9 kidneys being filtered. So it's just about the way you think about it. And one of the things that connects this, so you're thinking about water and you're thinking about waste and you're thinking about food, you're thinking about biodiversity, you're thinking about the food web, but also the environmental web. There's no question that biodiversity is key to a healthy planet and to healthy humans. Certainly Sir David Attenborough has recently highlighted this in his most recent Netflix documentary, My Life on This Planet. The reality is the survival of the human race is actually pegged against solving the problem of biodiversity and the planet. All the numbers, if you look at them, we've lost 60% of all biodiversity identified to date. We need to rebuild that biodiversity to sustain human life. And in order to do that, we've got to start working with nature to fix the planet rather than working against it. And food and hunger and how we address that is one of the key elements of how we're going to solve the problem.
So it's really clear by addressing the problems of world hunger, we can have an impact on lots of other goals as well. We'll explore some of the details of the technologies and approaches in a later episode. And don't forget, we want to hear what you want to know about, what your thoughts are, interests, and the rest.
So for the moment, we'd just like to say thank you for joining us on the journey to becoming Sustainable AF.
Thanks,
See you next
guys.
time.